Badlands, South Dakota, October 1888. The men stood in a loose half-circle outside the general store, watching Martha Henley unload pine planks from her wagon, and their laughter carried across the dusty street like crows mocking a scarecrow. She was 32 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with calloused hands and copper-brown hair she kept braided tight against her skull. Her husband had died of pneumonia the previous winter, leaving her with 160 acres of scrubland, 12 cattle, and a mortgage she couldn't pay. The ranch house had burned down in August when lightning struck the roof during a dry storm, and she'd been sleeping in the barn ever since. But the barn was drafty and poorly built, already losing shingles to the autumn winds that rattled the walls and sent mice scurrying through gaps in the floorboards. Martha had spent 3 weeks studying the landscape, walking the ravines and bluffs that cut through her property like scars in ancient flesh, and she'd found something the previous owner had never mentioned: a deep overhang in the sandstone cliff face at the northern edge of her land, a natural alcove 20 feet deep and nearly 30 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough for a grown man to stand upright. The stone was the color of dried blood in certain light, weathered smooth by centuries of wind and rain, and when she'd first stepped inside, the temperature had dropped noticeably, the stone holding a coolness even in the August heat. She'd made her decision then, standing in that ancient shelter with dust motes floating in the slanted sunlight. She would build her home inside that stone shelter, a cabin within a cave, insulated by the earth itself, and protected from the killing winds that swept down from Canada each winter with a fury that could strip flesh from bone. When she'd mentioned her plan to the banker, he'd laughed so hard he'd coughed up phlegm into his handkerchief, his face turning purple with the effort. When she'd told the men at the lumber yard, they'd exchanged glances that said she'd lost her mind to grief, their eyes sliding away from hers with a mixture of pity and contempt. Now, Thomas Wardle, who owned the neighboring spread and had made it clear he expected her to fail and sell to him at a loss, leaned against the storefront and called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "Building yourself a barn cabin, are you, Martha? Gonna live with the goats and the field mice? That's fitting work for a woman who thinks she can ranch alone." The other men chuckled, and one of them, a ranch hand named Polk with tobacco-stained teeth and breath that smelled of whiskey even at midday, added, "My granddaddy kept his hogs in a cave once. They all froze when the wind blew the snow in sideways. You'll be an icicle by Christmas, Mrs. Henley. Mark my words." Martha didn't turn around. She hefted another plank onto her shoulder, feeling the weight settle across her collarbone, the rough wood catching on the fabric of her work shirt, and carried it to the wagon bed. Her back ached from the loading, a deep throb that started at her spine and radiated outward, and her hands were raw from handling rough-cut lumber without gloves, splinters embedded under her fingernails like tiny accusations. But she'd learned long ago that responding to men like Wardle only fed their sport, gave them permission to continue their mockery with renewed energy. She finished loading, paid the store clerk with coins she'd earned selling 2 cows, counting them out one by one onto the scarred wooden counter, and drove her wagon out of town without a word. Behind her, the laughter faded into the distance, but she knew the mockery would follow her like a shadow, spreading through the territory in whispered conversations and knowing looks. In a territory where survival depended on reputation and the goodwill of neighbors, she was marking herself as foolish, stubborn, perhaps mad. She didn't care. She'd seen what winter did to poorly built structures, had watched boards crack and nails pop when the temperature dropped to 40 below. She'd watched her husband cough himself to death in a drafty house that couldn't keep out the cold, his breath coming in wet rattles as frost formed on the inside of the windows. She would not make that mistake again. The alcove sat at the base of a sandstone bluff that rose like a broken tooth from the prairie, its entrance facing southeast, which meant it caught the morning sun, but stayed sheltered from the north and west winds that brought the worst of the winter storms. Martha had spent days studying the site, watching how water drained during rain, noting where snow accumulated and where it blew clear, observing the patterns of light and shadow as the sun moved across the sky. The floor of the alcove sloped gently downward toward the entrance, which was good for drainage, but meant she'd need to build a raised platform for her living space. The stone walls were porous sandstone, soft enough to carve with hand tools, but stable enough to have stood for thousands of years, their surface marked with the striations of ancient seas and the scratches of animals that had sheltered here before. She'd found ancient soot marks on the ceiling near the back, evidence that others had sheltered here long ago, perhaps the Lakota or the peoples before them, and she'd traced the marks with her fingers, feeling a connection across time. That gave her confidence. If the alcove had protected people through centuries of winters, it could protect her through one more. She began by clearing the floor, hauling out rocks and debris, sweeping away layers of dust and animal droppings with a broom she'd made from bundled twigs. Then she measured the space, marking out a cabin footprint of 16 feet by 12 feet, positioned toward the back of the alcove where the ceiling was highest, and the stone walls would provide the most insulation. She would build a timber frame structure with proper walls, a door, and a window, but the alcove itself would serve as an outer shell, a natural barrier against wind and snow. The stone ceiling would prevent heat from escaping upward, and the earth-backed walls would hold warmth far better than any wooden ranch house standing exposed on the prairie. She worked alone, starting each day before dawn when the air was still and cold, her breath forming clouds in the darkness and continuing until her hands were too numb to grip the tools. The first task was building a foundation platform, since the alcove floor was uneven and she needed to raise her living space above any water that might seep in during spring thaw or heavy rain. She hauled flat stones from the surrounding ravines, carrying them one at a time in a leather sling across her back, the weight digging into her shoulders until the muscles burned and trembled. She laid them in courses to create a level base 18 inches high, checking the alignment with a string and a plumb bob she'd fashioned from a stone tied to twine. Her shoulders burned and her knees ached from crouching, the joints stiffening in the cold morning air. But she kept working, pausing only to drink water from a canteen and eat cold biscuits she'd baked in batches, the dry crumbs catching in her throat. Once the stone platform was complete, she began framing the cabin walls using the pine lumber she'd bought in town. She'd learned carpentry from her father, who'd built barns across 3 states, and had taught her to read wood grain and understand how timber would move as it dried. And though her hands were smaller and her strength less than a man's, she knew how to use leverage and patience to compensate. She notched the corner posts with a handsaw and chisel, the repetitive motion making her wrists ache, fitted the sill beams, and raised the wall frames one section at a time, bracing them with ropes tied to iron stakes she'd driven into cracks in the stone with a sledgehammer that left her arms trembling. The work was slow and exacting, and twice she made mistakes that forced her to disassemble sections and start over, wasting precious lumber and time, cursing herself for carelessness even as she learned from each error. By mid-October, the frame was standing, and she began nailing planks to create solid walls, leaving space for a door on the southeast side and a small window on the east wall to let in morning light. The sound of her hammer echoed off the stone walls, a rhythmic percussion that became almost meditative. The window was a luxury she could barely afford, a single pane of glass she'd purchased from a traveling merchant who'd looked at her with pity and charged her half price. wrapping it carefully in burlap to protect it during transport. She installed it carefully, sealing the edges with tar and oakum to prevent drafts, her fingers black and sticky with the tar. The door she built from double-thick planks, hanging it on iron hinges she'd salvaged from the burned ranch house, and she carved a simple wooden latch that could be barred from inside with a heavy beam. The cabin was taking shape, a sturdy box of timber nestled inside the stone alcove like a seed inside a shell. But she knew the real challenge was still ahead. Insulation was everything. Without it, the cabin would be a wooden coffin, no warmer than the barn she'd abandoned. She needed to seal every gap, trap every bit of heat, and create a buffer against the cold that would soon descend with the weight of a physical presence. She began by chinking the gaps between the wall planks with a mixture of clay, grass, and animal hair she'd collected from her cattle, mixing it in a wooden trough until it reached the consistency of thick mud. She worked the mixture into every crack, smoothing it with her fingers until the walls were sealed tight, her hands cramping from the repetitive motion. Then she turned her attention to the space between the cabin walls and the stone alcove. This gap, ranging from 3 to 6 feet depending on the irregularities of the stone, would serve as a dead air insulation layer, but only if she managed it correctly. She gathered dried prairie grass by the wagon load, cutting it with a scythe and hauling it back to the alcove, where she packed it tightly into the gap between the cabin and the stone. The grass would trap air and provide insulation, and its dryness would prevent rot and mold. She worked methodically, stuffing the grass into every available space, climbing on makeshift scaffolding to reach the higher sections, the dry stalks scratching her arms and face. Ventilation was the next problem, one that had killed more pioneers than cold alone. A sealed cabin with a fire burning inside could fill with smoke and suffocate its occupants, or the buildup of moisture from breathing and cooking could condense on the walls and freeze, creating ice sheets that would steal heat and promote sickness. Martha had seen both outcomes in her years on the frontier, had heard stories of families found dead in their cabins with no marks on them, just the silent killer of bad air, and she was determined to avoid them. She carved a ventilation channel into the sandstone near the top of the alcove, using a hammer and chisel to create a narrow chimney that angled upward and exited above the bluff, where wind would draw the smoke away. The work was brutal, each strike of the chisel sending shocks through her wrists that made her hands go numb, and the sandstone dust filled her lungs until she coughed red, spitting bloody phlegm onto the stone floor. It took her 5 days to carve a passage large enough, working in short bursts when the pain became too intense, and when she finally broke through to the outside air, feeling the sudden draft on her face. She sat down on the stone floor and wept from exhaustion and relief, her body shaking with sobs she couldn't control. She built a small fireplace inside the cabin, positioning it directly beneath the ventilation channel, and constructed a stone chimney that funneled smoke upward into the carved passage. She tested it with a small fire, watching anxiously as smoke rose and disappeared into the channel, holding her breath as she waited to see if it would back up. And when she saw it emerge from the bluff top without backing up into the cabin, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, a rare smile crossing her weathered face. She also carved smaller ventilation holes near the floor of the alcove, narrow slits that would allow fresh air to enter while preventing snow from blowing in. She covered these with wooden grates she could close during the worst storms. By late October, the cabin was nearly complete, and Martha turned her attention to the practical necessities of survival. She built a sleeping platform against the back wall, raising it off the floor to avoid the coldest air that would settle like an invisible lake, and stuffed a mattress tick with more prairie grass and a wool blanket she'd traded for. She constructed shelves for food storage, positioning them high where mice and insects would have trouble reaching. She dug a small root cellar into the floor of the alcove outside the cabin, lining it with stones and covering it with a wooden hatch, and stocked it with potatoes, turnips, carrots, and onions she'd harvested from the garden she'd managed to grow during the summer. She'd slaughtered one of her older cows and smoked the meat in a makeshift smokehouse, hanging strips of beef from racks until they were dried and preserved, the smell of smoke and salt filling the air. She'd rendered the fat into tallow for candles and soap, and she'd saved the hide to use as an extra blanket. She filled every container she owned with water from the creek that ran through the ravine below her property, and she stored the containers inside the cabin where they wouldn't freeze solid. She gathered firewood obsessively, cutting dead trees and hauling logs back to the alcove until she had a stack that reached nearly to the stone ceiling, enough to last through even the longest winter if she was careful. She knew that once the deep cold arrived, she might be trapped for weeks at a time, unable to leave the alcove, and she prepared accordingly. The townspeople heard about her progress through the occasional ranch hand who rode past her property and reported back, and the stories they told made her sound like a madwoman, a hermit building a cave dwelling out of desperation and delusion. Thomas Wardell made a point of stopping by in early November, riding up to the alcove entrance with two of his men, and he sat on his horse looking at the cabin with an expression of amused contempt, his eyes scanning the structure as if searching for obvious flaws. "You've put a lot of work into this folly, Martha," he said, his voice carrying the false kindness of a man who enjoyed watching others fail. "But you know it won't hold. First real cold snap, that timber will crack and the whole thing will collapse. You'd be better off taking my offer and moving to town before you freeze to death out here." Martha stood in the doorway of her cabin, her arms crossed, and met his gaze without flinching. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Wardle, but I'll manage," she said quietly. "You're welcome to check on me come spring." Wardell shook his head, smiling, and turned his horse away. "Won't be nothing to check on but a corpse," he said over his shoulder. "But suit yourself. Some people have to learn the hard way." His men laughed, and they rode off, leaving Martha standing alone in the mouth of the alcove. She watched them go, feeling a cold knot of anger and fear in her chest, but she pushed it down and went back to work. The weather turned in mid-November, the temperature dropping suddenly as a cold front swept down from the north, bringing sleet and freezing rain that coated everything in a layer of ice that made the world look like it had been dipped in glass. Martha retreated into her cabin, sealing the door and lighting a fire in the small fireplace, and she was astonished by how well the structure held heat. The stone alcove absorbed the warmth and radiated it back, and the insulation layer of dried grass prevented drafts from penetrating the walls. The temperature inside the cabin stayed comfortable, even as the wind howled outside, and she realized with a surge of hope that her design was working. She spent the cold days organizing her supplies, mending clothes, and reading the few books she owned by candlelight. She'd brought her husband's Bible, a volume of Shakespeare with a cracked leather binding, and a farmer's almanac, and she rationed her reading the way she rationed her food, allowing herself only a few pages each day to make them last. The isolation was the hardest part, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional groan of the wind outside. She talked to herself sometimes, just to hear a human voice, reciting passages from Shakespeare or reading aloud from the Bible, and she found herself thinking about her husband more than she had in months, remembering the way he'd laughed at her stubbornness and the way he'd supported her ideas, even when they seemed impractical. She missed him with an ache that felt physical, a hollow space in her chest that never quite filled. But she also felt a strange pride in what she'd accomplished alone. She was surviving, and she was doing it on her own terms. December arrived with clear skies and bitter cold, the kind of cold that made the air itself feel sharp and dangerous, that made exposed skin burn within seconds. Martha ventured out only to fetch firewood and check on her remaining cattle, which she'd moved to a sheltered ravine where they could find some protection from the wind. She'd built a rough windbreak for them using logs and brush, and she checked their water supply daily, breaking the ice that formed overnight with an axe, the impact sending shards flying. The cattle were thin but alive, and she knew that if she could get them through the winter, she'd have the foundation of a herd that could sustain her. The trips outside were brutal, the cold biting through her layers of wool and leather, making her eyes water and her lungs ache, and she learned to move quickly and efficiently, minimizing her exposure. Back inside the cabin, she would strip off her outer clothes and huddle by the fire until feeling returned to her fingers and toes, the painful tingling of returning circulation, and she would eat a small meal of smoked beef and boiled potatoes, savoring the warmth of the food as much as the taste. She was losing weight. She could feel it in the way her clothes hung loose, but she was surviving, and that was enough. She marked the days on a piece of wood with a knife, carving a notch for each one, and she watched the tally grow with a mixture of satisfaction and dread. Winter was only beginning. The blizzard arrived on the 15th of December, announced by a sudden drop in temperature and a sky that turned the color of old iron. Martha had been watching the weather obsessively, reading the signs the way her father had taught her, noting the behavior of birds and the quality of the light, and she knew this storm would be different from the others. She spent the morning hauling in extra firewood, stacking it inside the cabin until there was barely room to move, and she filled every pot and bucket with water from the creek, making trip after trip until her shoulders screamed in protest. She checked the ventilation channel, making sure it was clear, and she sealed the small air vents near the floor of the alcove, closing the wooden grates and packing them with cloth to prevent snow from blowing in. Then she retreated into the cabin, barred the door, and waited. The storm hit just after noon, the wind rising from a whisper to a roar in a matter of minutes, and the snow came horizontally, driven by gusts that shook the cabin walls and made the timber creak. Martha sat by the fire, feeding it carefully, and listened to the storm rage outside. The sound was immense, a constant howling that seemed to come from every direction at once, and she could hear the wind slamming against the bluff, battering the stone with a force that made her grateful for the alcove's protection. Inside the cabin, the air stayed warm and still, the stone walls and the insulation layer doing their job, and she realized with a sense of wonder that she was safe. The storm could not reach her here. The blizzard lasted 3 days, the wind never dropping below a scream, and the snow piled up in drifts that buried the landscape under a white shroud. Martha stayed inside, rationing her firewood and her food, and she tried not to think about what was happening beyond the alcove. She knew that other homesteaders would be struggling, their poorly built cabins leaking heat and letting in the cold, their livestock freezing in open fields. She thought about Thomas Wardle and his smug certainty that she would fail, and she wondered if he was regretting his words now. On the third night, the wind finally began to die, the howling fading to a moan and then to silence, and Martha opened the door of her cabin and looked out into the alcove. The entrance was partially blocked by a drift of snow, but the alcove itself was clear, the overhang having protected it from the worst of the accumulation. She dug a path through the drift using a shovel she'd kept inside and emerged into a world transformed. The prairie was buried under snow that reached past her knees, and the sky was a pale, brittle blue, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. She could see smoke rising from distant homesteads, thin columns that spoke of fires burning low, and she wondered how many people had made it through the storm. She checked on her cattle and found them huddled together in the ravine, half buried in snow, but alive. She dug them out and broke the ice on their water, and she scattered some of the hay she'd stored in a lean-to nearby. They were weak and shivering, but they would survive. She made her way back to the alcove, her legs aching from wading through the deep snow, and she spent the rest of the day clearing the entrance and restocking her firewood supply. That night, she allowed herself an extra portion of food, a small celebration of survival, and she slept deeply for the first time in days, the exhaustion finally catching up with her. She dreamed of her husband, and in the dream he was standing in the alcove, looking at the cabin she'd built, and he was smiling. When she woke, she felt a strange sense of peace, as if he'd given her his approval from wherever he was now. The first visitor arrived 2 days after the storm. A ranch hand from the Wardell spread, riding a horse that looked half dead from exhaustion. He stopped at the alcove entrance, staring at the cabin with an expression of disbelief, and when Martha emerged, he removed his hat and spoke in a voice rough with cold. "Mrs. Henley, Mr. Wardell sent me to check on you. We lost 2 line shacks in the storm, and 3 men are missing. We thought you'd be—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Martha nodded, understanding. "I'm fine," she said simply. The cabin held. The ranch hand looked past her at the structure nestled inside the stone alcove, and she could see him trying to reconcile what he was seeing with the mockery he'd likely participated in weeks before. "How?" he asked finally. "How did you manage it?" Martha shrugged, feeling the weight of her exhaustion and her triumph. "I built it right," she said. "Stone and earth don't lie. They'll protect you if you work with them instead of against them." The ranch hand nodded slowly, and she could see respect dawning in his eyes, grudging but real. "Mr. Wardell will want to know," he said. "He'll want to see this." Martha felt a flicker of satisfaction but kept her expression neutral. "He's welcome to visit," she said, "but I'm not selling." Over the following weeks, as the winter settled into a grinding routine of cold and snow, word spread about Martha Henley's barn cabin, the structure that had withstood the worst blizzard in a decade. People began stopping by, travelers and neighbors who wanted to see it for themselves, and Martha found herself explaining her design over and over, describing the insulation layer, the ventilation system, the way the stone alcove provided a natural thermal mass that held heat. Some of the visitors were skeptical, looking for flaws or reasons to dismiss her success, but most were genuinely curious, and a few even asked for advice on improving their own shelters. Thomas Wardell came in late January, riding up with a smaller entourage than before, and he stood in the alcove for a long time, studying the cabin without speaking. Finally, he turned to Martha and said, "You proved me wrong, Mrs. Henley. I didn't think it could be done." His voice was flat, without the mockery that had colored it before, and Martha recognized it as the closest thing to an apology she would get. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. Wardell nodded, and then he surprised her by asking, "Would you be willing to show my men how you built the ventilation system? We're planning to rebuild the line shacks, and I'd like to incorporate some of your ideas." Martha considered for a moment, weighing her pride against the practical benefits of cooperation, and then she agreed. "I'll show them," she said, "but I want fair payment for my time." Wardle smiled, a thin but genuine expression. "That's fair," he said. She spent the rest of the winter in relative comfort, the cabin holding steady against every storm that followed, and she used the time to plan for spring. She would rebuild her herd, plant a larger garden, and perhaps even hire a hand to help with the work. She'd proven that she could survive alone, but she was beginning to understand that survival and thriving were different things, and that accepting help didn't mean admitting weakness. In late February, a warm Chinook wind blew in from the west, melting the snow in great rushing streams that turned the prairie into a muddy lake, and Martha stood at the entrance of the alcove, watching the water drain away and feeling the sun on her face for the first time in months. She thought about the men who had mocked her, the laughter that had followed her through town, and she realized that she didn't feel angry anymore. She'd built something that worked, something that had saved her life, and that was vindication enough. The respect of others was a bonus, welcome, but not necessary. She'd learned to respect herself, and that was the foundation everything else was built on. Spring came slowly, the land emerging from the snow in patches of brown and green, and Martha began the work of rebuilding. She repaired fences, tended her cattle, and planted her garden, and she found that the work felt lighter now, less desperate. She'd survived the worst, and she knew she could do it again if she had to. In April, a young couple stopped by the alcove, newly married and looking to homestead nearby, and they asked if she would teach them how to build a similar shelter. Martha agreed, and over the course of several weeks, she guided them through the process, sharing the lessons she'd learned through trial and error. The couple listened intently, taking notes and asking questions, and Martha realized that she was passing on knowledge that might save their lives someday. It felt good, purposeful, and she understood that this was part of survival too, the sharing of wisdom and the building of community. By summer, the couple had completed their own alcove cabin, smaller than Martha's but built on the same principles, and they invited her to a meal to celebrate. She accepted, and as she sat at their rough-hewn table, eating stew and bread and listening to their plans for the future, she felt a connection she hadn't experienced since her husband's death. She was no longer alone, not truly, and the isolation that had nearly broken her was transforming into something else, something that felt like belonging. The years that followed were not easy, but they were manageable, and Martha Henley became a fixture of the community, known not for her barn cabin, but for her knowledge and her willingness to help others survive. She never remarried, though there were offers, and she never left the alcove, even after she could afford to build a proper house. The cabin had saved her life, and she felt a loyalty to it that went beyond practicality. She expanded it over time, adding a second room and improving the insulation, and she continued to refine the design, always looking for ways to make it more efficient. Other homesteaders adopted her techniques, building their own alcove shelters or incorporating her ventilation and insulation methods into their existing structures, and the survival rate in the region improved noticeably. Martha took quiet pride in that, though she never spoke of it publicly. She'd set out to prove that she could survive alone, and she'd succeeded. But in the process, she'd discovered something more important. That survival was not just about enduring, but about building something that lasted, something that could shelter others when the storms came. And the storms always came, in one form or another. But she was ready for them now, and so were the people she'd taught. The barn cabin, once an object of ridicule, had become a symbol of resilience, and Martha Henley, the woman who'd built it, had earned a respect that no amount of mockery could diminish. She'd faced the worst blizzard and emerged stronger, and that was a story worth telling, a story that would outlast the winter and the storms and the years, a story of one woman who refused to give up and built her survival with her own two hands.